Greetings and welcome back to Church in the World. This is part 2 of our series, and today it's going to be the third in our discussion on abortion. Today we're going to talk about public policy regarding abortion. Now, before we get too far into the weeds on this, the first thing I want to say is if you heard that immediately said, why is a pastor talking about public policy? Well, I don't think that you absorbed everything from our church and society discussion from last week. That was a 6 video series with an appendix. I really encourage you to check that out because that goes into why the church can talk about public policy and in fact should and does. So that question is over there. If that's what you're upset about, go watch those videos and engage them. That's not something I'm going to justify in this video. Therefore, since we're assuming the church has not only the cause to do so, but indeed the charge to talk about public policy, we've got to lay out some public policy guidelines of what we think as a church just public policy around abortion looks like. The first thing to say, right, is that there are 3 basic categories here to talk about. The law's role in prevention of unintended pregnancies, the law's role in the support for life after birth, and the law's role in the regulation of abortion. We're going to go through the first 2 fairly quickly because they're not really considered heavily debatable, right? Prevention of unintended pregnancies is crucial in lessening the number of abortions. In theory, everyone should agree less unintended pregnancies will mean less abortions. In addition to efforts within the church and home, we support appropriate forms of sex education in schools, community pregnancy prevention programs, and parenting preparation classes. We recognize the need for contraceptives to be available, for voluntary sterilization to be considered, and for research and development of new forms of contraception. So that's just a paragraph, right? It's the only thing the statement says about this on page 8. The reason why it's so short is because, let's just be very clear here. If you're living in a state where you don't have access to contraception, where children aren't receiving any sort of education about biology and reproduction, and therefore aren't making informed choices, we're not going to go after abortion restrictive legislation. That's not going to help. The problem is there is no effective means of preventing unintended pregnancies are not being pursued by the government, by the laws. That has to happen, right? Because we can equip people better than that. We can equip men and women and people of all kinds better than that. And when we do, we'll see the unintended pregnancies will drop, which means abortions will go down. And if we want to restrict the amount of abortions, reduce it to as low as possible, as humanly possible, the only way to do that is to create the conditions where abortions will go down. And studies and science tells us that you don't get rid of abortion by simply making it illegal. That doesn't work, right? We know that. That's simply a fact. Abortion has always in some form existed. Even though it is a method of last resort, by definition, if we increase options that are less painful and aren't abortion, right, then people will take those options. If people have free access to contraception, or at least available contraception to them, they're much less likely to get into a situation of unintended pregnancy. Then, support for life after birth. Okay. Many women choose abortion in a desperate attempt to survive in a hostile social environment. In order to affirm the value of life and reduce the number of abortions, it is essential for us as a church to work to improve support for life in society. So what is this going to say? That, first of all, we've got to stop this narrative of abortion as a personal moral failing. Abortion is a social failure. Whenever it is engaged in for reasons that aren't related to health and that aren't related to some sort of other social failure, such as situations of rape and incest, okay? There should be no circumstance where a woman needs to choose abortion because that person is not going to be able to care for the child and does not have access to others who will care for the child. That is unacceptable. Full stop. In a society where that is a thing that's happening, just like what we just talked about, where there's no sex education, no access to contraceptives, then what we were talking about when we want to reduce abortions must not be restricting abortion more, but rather, why on earth are these circumstances occurring? And how can we address them as a society? The statement then says, Greater social responsibility for the care, welfare, and education of children and families is needed through such measures as access to quality, affordable health care, child care, and housing. Sufficient income support for families needs to be provided by employers, or in the case of the unemployed, through government assistance. As a society, we need to provide increased support for education, nutrition, and services that protect children from abuse and neglect. Because parenthood is a vocation that women and men share, this church supports public and private initiatives to provide adequate maternity and paternity leaves, greater flexibility in the workplace, and efforts to correct the disparity between the incomes of men and women. The law must hold both parents responsible for the financial support of their children. Now, what this statement just read had nothing to do with what we think of as abortion policy, and yet what it's functionally saying is abortion is primarily a function of a social failure to support and provide for the citizens of the nation, right? For the people who live in the country. The government is responsible to encourage, support, and ensure social responsibility and care for all the vulnerable, especially children, to provide health insurance, childcare, housing, income support, either through employers or through the state directly. These things are not optional. They are not talking points. These are basic requirements the church expects the government to fulfill. And that's very interesting. And it's interesting because, as I'm sure you're aware, those talking points are huge political controversies in our country right now. What's the government's role in regulating the economy, in making sure that people have health care, in making sure that education is effective, in who gets to decide whether or not there's sex ed in schools and how? It's not certainly it doesn't seem to be doctors and social scientists who know the effects of what kinds of programs based on studies. No, it's who? The politicians who we elect, right? The politicians that we elect in this country therefore must be elected based on their ability and track record to do this work, to create this kind of environment of support for all lives after birth. Because when life is being supported after birth, abortions will go down, just as when persons who are already of an age where they can reproduce, when they have access to sexual education, when they have access to resources, when they have access to contraceptives, when they have access to medical care, unintended pregnancies go down, right? And that means abortions go down. So both of these things are gigantic legislative priorities that are much, much, much more interesting and much more broad than the question of how to legislate abortion. But there should be some sort of regulation for abortion. I don't think it's reasonable to think that the government doesn't have any role in regulating abortion because it's a serious surgical procedure. I ought not be allowed by law to go perform dentistry on my friend. That is absurd. There's got to be some level of regulation. There's regulation of cars, of tobacco, of alcohol, of the internet. So clearly, the question isn't whether there should be legislation that regulates abortion, but what level of regulation. This begins on page 9. Laws should be enacted and enforced justly for the preservation and enhancement of life and should avoid unduly encumbering or endangering the lives of women. So that's the first test, right? This is about preserving life. It is about avoiding creating circumstances that destroy, harm, or endanger other lives in preference of the unborn, whatever that means. So this church opposes the total lack of the regulation of abortion. We don't believe there should be no regulation. The church opposes legislation that would outlaw abortion in all circumstances. That's simply not tenable. It's a medical procedure for a reason. Sometimes it's medically needed, or at least can be medically necessary, depending on which doctor and your own personal discernment. Laws that prevent access to information about all options available to women faced with unintended pregnancies. We oppose that. Why would you not educate people so that they can make decisions? Why would you not help them understand that that's part of the education problem, right? That's part of the information access that is essential to allow people to make good moral choices, as well as the resource availability to engage those options. Then that's the next point. We oppose laws that deny access to safe and affordable services for morally justifiable abortions, right? We oppose laws that create mandatory or coerced abortion or sterilization. By the way, don't know if you know this, the United States has coerced or without approval or permission sterilized people before. So did the Nazis. So yeah, we don't think the government has any right to do that. Laws that prevent couples from practicing contraception, we oppose those. So if you're thinking, oh, well, what about the idea of preventing contraception? No, that's ridiculous. We don't believe in that. Laws that are primarily intended to harass those contemplating or deciding for an abortion, also we oppose. The position of the church is that in cases where the life of the mother is threatened, where pregnancy results from rape or incest, or where the embryo or fetus has lethal abnormalities incompatible with life, abortion prior to viability should not be prohibited by law or by lack of public funding of abortions for low-income women. On the other hand, this church supports legislation that prohibits abortions that are performed after the fetus is determined to be viable, which of course are already illegal, except when the mother's life is threatened or when lethal abnormalities indicate the prospective newborn will die very soon. Beyond these situations, the church neither supports nor opposes laws prohibiting abortion. That was a lot, but it boils down to some very simple things that we've already outlined, right? It boils down to when someone chooses abortion, not because of medical reason, the mother's life being in danger or the fetus being unlikely to survive, but chooses that because of the inability to support a child or the lack of equipment to carry the pregnancy to term, that is a societal failing the government needs to address if the government purports to care about life. And what we find, of course, when we analyze our current government is that it's not a matter of the virtue or value of life that's really being defended. It's rather a set of arguments that are being seen as tribal, that are dividing us, right? Because if you've noticed here, the Democratic Party would not agree with this statement as a general rule. The Republican Party certainly wouldn't in general. Why? Because neither party is truly interested in creating this level of legislative transformation. Imagine what would happen if we had a party that really said, well, I mean, obviously we want abortions to be as rare as possible, but in order to do that, we have to create a social safety net. We have to create widely available health care. We have to create systems of education that equip people so that they're aware of the choices they're making. We have to make sure contraceptives are available to everybody. We have to make sure that there are social programs to enable people to become parents unexpectedly without having to seek abortion as a way to avoid it. We have to prosper the family, right? And the other social institutions that support life. And that's not the conversation we're having. It's much easier to vilify the other person. You just want to kill unborn children. You just want to victimize women. Whether or not those arguments are true is rather beside the point. What we say instead is we want all lives valued. We want every single life valued. And that means that we can't create legislation or support legislation that is going to demean, degrade, or neglect anyone. And that includes the poor, the vulnerable, the stranger, the widow, the immigrant. And I make that list because it's a biblical one. Now, caveat, there are some things we haven't talked about and that need, according to this statement, further deliberation, right? How do we fund public access of abortions? We strongly affirm family communication support, but the law should recognize in some cases husband or partner involvement in the decision can be unwise or dangerous. So requiring parental consent when the woman is a minor, it should specify other trusted adults as alternatives. Further deliberation is needed on questions like how much consultation with spouse or partner should be needed, what to do in cases where there is no identifiable spouse or partner. These things need to be hammered through. And then the statement concludes, the church's role in society begins long before and extends far beyond legislative regulation. It seeks to shape attitudes and values that affirm people in whatever circumstances they find themselves. It is pastoral care, compassionate outreach, and life-sustaining assistance that are crucial in supporting those who bear children as well as those who choose not to do so. Through these and other means, the people of God seek to be truly supportive of life. What does this mean? It means the current abortion debate in American partisan politics is wrong, and the church isn't on either side of it, per se. But the church's demands around regulation of abortion are generally met in modern United States legislation, to my knowledge. I'm not a legislative expert, so feel free to comment with legal resources, nonpartisan legal resources in the comments. So we don't want abortion to be a method of birth control. That's not what we want at all. But we have to ask, are the numbers of abortions rooted in persons being irresponsible, individuals being irresponsible? Or are they rooted in social problems? Why are abortions higher very often among poor populations and minority populations? That's an indicator. Why are abortions higher in places where there is less access to contraceptives and less education around sexuality for children? These are factors. And so when somebody comes to us and says, well, I want to protect all life, and that's why we shouldn't allow any sort of legal access to abortion, our follow-up should be, great, and I suppose you also want to provide health care and social supports for all children regardless of their income status. And I think we'll find very quickly the way that politicians and the political discourse in this country has picked and chosen its talking points without having a conclusive and consistent ethic of life. We're going to see even more strongly how this is the case next time. This concludes our three-parter on abortion. Thank you very much for joining me. Tomorrow, we're going to come back to the ELCA's social statements, and we'll be tackling the death penalty. So until then, God bless.